Welcome back to our continuing discussion on the adolescence of Utena. We're on part 4, about half an hour into the film, and we're going to take a look at what I like to call the breakdowns. We said last time that this part of the film is focusing on the other characters with Utena in the background after seeing how Toga would behave to Anthe. In this segment, starting with what we went over and the story of the witch and Dios, we start to get the background behind everybody else and their issues and what they're struggling with. And that's going to let us, recontextualize or further contextualize the information we have already for Utena and her plight. The line that stands out to me here when Toga's talking to Akio on the phone is kind of that, oh, this is why you set up the game, indicating that Akio set up the game, which very much happens in the TV series of Utena, right? And he's kind of the final boss, but that's somewhat of a hoodwink in the adolescence of Utena. Akio is dead. When Toga says he'll be the one to obtain the power, what does that mean? He's dead too. Both Toga and Akio are manifestations of people that were important or controlling or centralizing in the lives of the other characters. They're things to be overcome. They're internal demons. Why do they banter back and forth about obtaining power? This connection's further reinforced when the sheet falls away and you see this painting of the prince and Anthe underneath the roses. And something that I really think is important for analyzing this scene in particular before we move on from here is these shots with the sheets in them and the drapes, the white drapes. Those are all from Shiori's point of view. She's the only character here. We know Toga isn't real. We know Shiori had a relationship with Toga before he drowned as a child. Shiori, by the way, means white in Japanese, so that's kind of why the background of the white sheets goes on here. So much like Utena did, Shiori created a manifestation of Toga, and then she has him behave like the prince would in her ideas. In this way, she's very much the foil to Utena, and we'll see that later in the chase sequence, as Shiori is not able to overcome the idea of Toga in much the same way that Utena very much is. This is much in the same way that Anthe is unable to overcome the idea of Dios or Akio. So when they go on about having the power or obtaining the power here, it's first and foremost a mindfuck to put these guys back in their role that they had in the show, but also at the same time kind of reinforce this idea that these characters that are dealing with these interactions of the prince or manifestations of the prince are giving the power to them. Again, I don't think Akio or Toga have anything to gain here, as they're not characters. They don't have motivations other than the ones that they're given by the people that create them or allow them to live on. And perhaps you could say that the desire for power or that lust to play that game or to gain dominion over other people is somehow intrinsic to the concept of the prince. I very much believe that's what Ikuhara's viewpoints are. What I think is interesting here is that Shiori's depiction of Toga is in some ways subservient to her, painting her toenails and things like that in a very sensual way. She's powerful by virtue of being associated with somebody who is out for power as well. Or that's kind of what Shiori's ideal situation would look like. Compare this lust for power to what we see from Mickey here, the transition. What are you hoping to gain from his sister? And then him saying, not giving an answer like, what? I don't understand. And furthermore, in his scene, he also sort of says, we can't go back to the garden, referencing the events of the show itself. And both these things, Mickey's denial for power and his idea of, moving forward, are both kind of antithetical to what Otori Academy is and very against what Kozue is looking for as well. So his relationship's a bit different because we haven't been shown or we don't know that Kozue or Mickey, don't exist or is a figment of someone else's imagination. So they're both kind of stuck here. Mickey, in spite of, what he says in this scene, can't really forget Kozue or move past Kozue, or he has his thing with Anthe too. And Kozue most definitely cannot give up her idea of Mickey or the prince or the future that they want together. And that's not expounded on anywhere in the movie itself. I think the movie has a lot less time for the side characters to get into their backstory and kind of borrows a lot from what we already know. Again, specifically mentioning the garden. But I don't think we really need a ton from these characters, and we get a little bit more in the scene with Juri later on. We can still tell they're very close or incestuous in some way, and being in the bath together, and that Kozue is very, very adamant I think this scene is very well constructed and very well placed in the greater scheme of things, though. I like the continuing motif of the white falling sheets and those being gradually torn away as either the status quo gets a little bit changed with Mickey's reluctance to stay there with Kozue forever, or more secrets being revealed and things coming to light in much the same way that them dropping off of the paintings so far has been used. One of the other things that I think about is that what makes the duelists special, or what makes them the people that want to rise above. And I think you get a glimpse of it at Mickey's reluctance there to continue on. It's something we mentioned in the first episode, but these people do say, go on ahead, we'll be right behind you. They are on the same path as Utena and Anthy. Maybe Mickey and Juri and Seonji get there someday. I'd also like to point out that the music flowing from between these scenes kind of gives this the impression that it's all happening at kind of the same time, and also that it's all connected in the same way, or the same thing is happening. The fact that the music used is this reserved piano piece, very simple, very slow, it makes me believe that this is a kind of a passive thing, or a very low intensity moment of kind of the daily lives of the characters. And I know this is just about maybe the least interesting short little scene in the entire film, but I really want to point this one out as being an example of the attention to detail and the visual storytelling that's prominent and makes Ikehara one of the most impressive directors in the modern anime age. This shot goes nicely with the lighting in the bathroom scene being kind of that diffused and soft orange yellow, but now it's really encapsulated by this really dark starry blue purple that we have on the outside here. I wouldn't necessarily say there's been a whole lot of lighting motifs going on throughout the film, but we did have the thing with Utena and Anthy earlier with the lighting switching on and off, and now we've kind of got that soft glow associated with that togetherness and that really open truthfulness and that honesty. But in this shot, that honesty is a little tiny bubble. That's one little thing, that's the stationary thing. And the gate opens towards the darkness and the outside. I just love how the shot of the metallic gate clanging open really matches the metallic sounding blinds that Utena pushes back. Anthy's walking out into that darkness. Utena is staying back behind the three, maybe more lights here. And yeah, just having Anthy disappear into that darkness. Oof. I mean, that's not a hard symbol to understand, but goodness is that effective. And this is what makes for good direction, right? Is you don't show, a shot of them in the hallway and Anthy like, I'm going out now. And then Utena saying, well, and that would be a different show entirely. That would break the tone. It would be something else, or overly crass, or a lower skill way of kind of showing that Anthy has these obligations, and that Utena, while she's aware of them and doesn't necessarily agree, she stands back and doesn't do anything to interfere with it. That says a lot, and it's a lot that's very crucial to this film. And it's told through this, visual metaphor, and it's told with respect towards the audience and a believability and understanding to the characters that really sells it as something that's occurring in this world. Shiori naked in the bed with Toga, implying that they had sex. Of course, Shiori's definition of the prince would include physical relationships, as most everybody's does, as shown by Anthy. But then we go into straight flashback mode. This is one of the areas of the movie that I feel I have the least amount of confidence in. There's obviously some big visual motifs, sort of like the spiraling sheets, kind of matching with this shot of the ceiling here. And child abuse is, again, one of those topics that Ikehara loves to cover because other people definitely don't. When I look at this, though, I suppose my problem is I'm not quite sure how it ties into the idea of the prince and what goes on Anthy and Utena escaping Otri Academy. I'm of a couple minds about this. First, it could be just in relation to the show. Toga's implied to have some sort of trauma in his story in the show, to have a lot of backstory in there that we see through various things of meeting Utena in the coffin, his history with Nanami and Seonji. Geek Nights goes into that in a lot more depth, and I really encourage you to go watch their video specifically on those episodes. And what's more, I think that the idea of like abandoned children or forgotten children or children that have overcome trauma is much, much, much better explored in Penguin Drum, where it's given enough time and impact in the plot to become a central point of the show. Instead here, I think the idea is to, one, show that Toga is not villain. You know, he's not the person you need to overcome like he sort of was in the end of Utena. Your first time viewing this after viewing the series, it would still sort of come as a mindfuck to you. But I feel like one of the key lines is when Toga says, "I lost a lot of things, but through that I was able to duel at the academy." I know I sound like a broken record now, but Toga being a manifestation of this time Shiori's idea of what Toga would become, this kind of implies that the trauma allowed for Toga to start participating in the toxic masculinity of Otri Academy and the prince. That had Toga not been abused as a child, he would then not have something to overcome or not fall subject to this concept. This idea of the prince that tells him he needs to duel, he needs to go seek out power, and he needs to become someone who's dominant, dashing, powerful, admirable. We talked a lot about it in the feminism angle earlier, but I think that the male characters in Utena get kind of a bad rap for being quote-unquote evil, when I think they're more pitiable. And certainly in this movie, you're given less room to interpret Akio or Toga as malicious and more as products of the system, or being themselves unable to escape the idea of the prince that was thrust upon them. Is this possibly Ikehara course correcting because too many people were reading the men as the villain in the series? I wonder if Toga jumps off the boat and tries to rescue the girl, if he's not trying to be the prince. Is that feigned chivalry, or is that him? Do Shiori or Utena see it that way? Anyway, this next bit with the coiling sheets. Again, I think the sheets are really tied with Shiori. They're tied with lies and deception and wrapping things up. And that's kind of the visual metaphor that we get here. It's repeated often, though, so maybe there's a better reading that I'm not really aware of. And I'll put another possible interpretation that someone linked to me in the show notes down below. Shiori, though, doesn't respond to Toga's, trauma or anything like that. She puts it back on Shuri and says she's such a terrible person. She expects Toga to go fight her or beat her, whereas Toga, his response there is kind of like, what? Shuri's idea of a prince is somebody who overcomes her enemies for her. And to cap off how kind of avant-garde this scene is, Ikuni pulls this bullshit, and I really honestly can't say that I like this too much. What's shown on screen is the rape of Toga by his stepfather in the Cabbage Patch, and the audio is Shiori talking about Shuri and how she's, hates her, gonna manipulate her, things along those lines. I think it does do a really good job of setting up the fact that Shiori doesn't give two fucks about Toga. She would talk over his innermost trauma. If the duelists are people that are on the road to escape Otri Academy or overcome what's holding them back, Shiori is actively one of the people that is preventing them from leaving, as, we see in the chase scene metaphor. And it's behavior like this that shows she really has no conscience or care for other people or desire to help anyone at all. Aesthetically is where I think the scene gets a little muddy. And I don't just mean the grain for the flashback, which I think is actually a really cool trick and works really well with the painterly style of the movie. You get the cabbage transforming into what looks sort of like a nipple, and you have Shiori emerging as a butterfly from the sheets coiling around. I'm still stuck on that being her web of lies, and that's kind of what gives her wings. It's obviously intended to be very dreamlike and ephemeral, and she does a lot of covering up, even the fact that Toga's dead, or the videotape later on. The sheets are this outer veneer of white, of chastity, of purity, but then underneath the sheets, as we've seen in this scene, she's anything but pure and chaste. And Shiori as a moth, maybe, being only black and white, is that she sees things in only black and white, or that her whiteness on the outside is tainted by the black spots throughout. Remember Utena's outfit in the beginning, equal parts white and black. Even though she's born out of this cocoon of whiteness, even though her name is literally white, in the end she's still that black car, trying to tear people down. To continue with this color theory, when we see, the reality, or things that are meaningful, it's not coded in black and white. And, it's a childish way of thinking the evil guys versus the good guys. So Shiori and Utena, at their starting points, are both kind of white and black at the same time. And then they enter into this situation or this adolescence, and they have to figure out what's white and what's black and what's up and what's down. They can't very well stay in these childish flashbacks when things are black and white very clearly, and the saturation of the real world and that soft glow of yellow is always there. Shiori just happens to choose the black path and think of things as black. And I think we get a confirmation here as the scene ends that what separates the duelists from the chaff is that they are trying to improve and be better people. And that's really what the high goals are, right? Shiori is very much like Utena, whereas she takes the petty route and Utena tries to rise above and overcome and accept the issues instead of, inflicting pain on other people. It's very, very much in the veins of all the climaxes of Sailor Moon, where the bad guys have these values where they take it poorly, they want to inflict pain on other people and get their petty revenge. Usagi comes in with the idea that it's not us versus them, it's not the black and white. It's simultaneously much more complicated than that, but also so much more simpler than that. Now, I know we said we'd move on from this scene, but first, two more things that I want to point out that I may have missed while we were going through it. First of all, I want to call out the symbolism of Shiori as moth here. Moths are not parasites, but what you would call pests, right? They eat your clothes, they eat the cabbage. They're generally not wanted. And she's also kind of consuming Toga in that regard, the way a moth would consume a cabbage. The particular shot in question that makes this very clear is when Toga's being raped. He looks up and the camera looks up in his point of view, and we see Shiori as the moth kind of fly down, arms open, embracing him. That is that she spied some weakness in him and swooped in his moment of weakness to exploit him and, make him into her meal. Keep that and really everything that happens in the Shiori scene in mind for when we talk about the Rose Garden scene later on, and how Shiori will contrast with Utena and Anthy there. And that's kind of a nice segue into our next point here, is that Toga himself is a much different character in this film than he is in the series. He's made sympathetic here, and he's kind of whitewashed of all his evil deeds. We kind of talked a little bit about that in relation to the hoodwink, coming in from the series, expecting him to be this manipulative person that he is in the series. But after this scene, it's hard to think about him as anything but sympathetic or worthy of your pity. I think that's primarily because he's playing a different role here. He's not specifically set up to be antagonistic, instead only to make us expect him to be antagonistic. But the reason we can completely absolve Toga of all of his guilt from the series is because in this movie, he is not a character. He does not have the complexity of the character. He is very black and white, and this time white, because he's an idea. In Utena's mind, as in Shiori's, as we see in this scene, the idea of Toga is sacrosanct because he is someone who, for whatever reason, now has the stigma of giving his life for somebody else. So that's an internally pure deed that makes him seem like someone who could do no wrong if he grew up into adulthood. Those two characters always remember Toga as perfect. Compare this with Anthy and Dios, who she created from that type of idea. She made manifest into the real world that pure idea, and then became this corrupt thing, and could not exist. This ties back in, too, with the black and white of Utena's outfit and Juri as the moth, where, as a child, you can think about things in these very object ways, but life isn't like that, and adulthood isn't like that, and it's something that you have to surrender as you move forward to adulthood through adolescence. So we see here Toga an example of how you would do a character, or how you would portray a character that is not so much a character but more a representation of ideas. Sort of like Madoka from Madoka Magica. Utena and now Shiori too are trapped thinking that Toga was a good person, or impeccably good, or righteous to the last, or fulfilling the idea of the prince as manifest through their idea of what Toga would have been or was in the past, has prevented them from accepting the reality and has left them stuck in Otri Academy. This next scene's got a lot, but I think it's a lot of stuff that we've really already touched on or really already know. First things first, the setting is the garage where is kept all the things that will later in the chase sequence try to tear down Anthy or prevent her from escaping Otri Academy. That is all the non-duelists, all the people that are stuck in their ways. the people like Shiori. Very quickly, before we get into the weeds on the dialogue, I want to point out some things. There's the obvious gender role reversal of Juri being a very tall and very manly person, whereas Mickey is a very effeminate and very slight man. Probably read this as the reason partially why they're social outcasts, or they don't buy into the established roles. That is, they're both still trying to play the prince because that's what's socially expected of them. However, they're both kind of bad at it. And seeing how Toga and Akio, two people that are pretty good at it, ended up, maybe that's a good thing for them. It becomes very much obvious when we see Juri next to Shiori later on. And also remember Juri's role as a foil for Utena's gender-swapping behavior. That's not what avails her the day, as they both do it, but only one of them ends up leaving. Now remember, we consider the duelist people that are slightly above the average person in accepting their inner struggles and trying to acknowledge the fact that they need to abandon the prince to get out of Otri Academy. The end of the world, which Juri brings up here, being likely that. Escaping Otri Academy. So in this scene, they know that this darkness, or this is the way that they need to go to get out. And I can't really be sure because the scene's kind of weird later on, but it's likely the same place that Utena turns into a car and Anthe leaves via. So consider this Juri and Mickey standing on the precipice. They know the path that they need to walk, they're just hesitant in walking it. As Mickey says, it's scary. And also, much like the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya when we talked about Kyon making progress and going forward and backwards across the screen, Juri and Mickey start off walking to the left here, and Japanese written traditionally top to bottom, right to left. That means when you're making progress or you're moving forward in Japan, you're moving towards the left. This too is consistent with how Anthe's escape sequence is shot and framed. Remember Akio as the final obstacle barring her way to the left. Note that they are going slow, they're walking at a leisurely pace, they're on the right track, but they need to go 500 kilometers an hour instead of 3. And they are stopped dead in their tracks. Their forward progress is halted when one of the other people around them shows them the image of Dios, the consummate ideal of the perfect prince. They hesitate, they're distracted. The idea of the prince stopped them from moving towards the end of the world and their destination. Juri asks why Mickey is a duelist. He responds with, "I was chosen," right as Kozue's name flashes before his face. Note that he's now facing towards the right side of the screen, which would be backwards, which would be the opposite of the progress towards the left side of the screen. Kozue is holding him back from moving to the left. The red coloring matches the red of the roses associated again with the prince. Kozue needs him to be her prince. As we flash back to the ducky, calling back to the bath scene, reinforcing that idea that Kozue is the reason Mickey can't move on. There's again talk of power, which wasn't something that was mentioned earlier, though it was when Toga was talking to Akio on the phone. It seems that the prince must necessarily want to obtain power as part of the whatever makes the prince. Then Juri, the confirmed lesbian, who in this movie and in the series we know to be interested only in women, makes a very awkward pass on Mickey. That red light, that vision of Dios, that put the two back in their role. That reminded them that they have reason to become the prince. For Juri, that means assuming that very toxic sexuality that was associated with Utena's concept of Toga and her interactions with Anthe earlier that we noted. They've stopped moving to the left entirely. And then of course, Shiori. Mickey's first line, "Ordinary students are not allowed in here," which gives credence to the fact that Shiori could possibly have been one of the duelists, as she has not turned into a car yet, like the others. However, what she does in the visual language of the film is draw the two back to the right side of the screen, back to the top right side of the screen where you would start to write, and the rest is really just the emotional manipulation of Juri by Shiori. It's pretty straightforward, and I think both the voice actresses in English and Japanese do a pretty good job of showing how artificial Shiori's, let's say, exploitation truly is. Again, stopping her from moving forward and dragging her back right, and Mickey has some line about constraint as it focuses on Shiori grabbing hold of Juri. I think we really talked that one to death a little bit, and despite not understanding it my first time through, I do think it is one of the more straightforward or obvious scenes in regards to the symbolism in the movie. That's all to say, I'm really excited for this next part. This is honest to God my favorite scene in all of anime. It's a large part of why I love both this movie and Kunihiko Ikahara so much, and it was absolutely the reason I decided to do these videos. As a preamble sort of The dance of Utena and Anthe and the scene in the rose garden preceding it has never been matched in my eyes in terms of efficacy, of style, of creativity. I honestly could not think more highly of this scene. Let's go through everything. Anthe was leaving at night previously, Utena noticed. Looking at her leaving out the window, where was she going? Presumably Utena followed her on this night. She was going to tend the roses, which again are a symbol for the prince. That could metaphorically be anything, but it's really the fact that Anthe is beholden to the prince and captive to the roses. She created Dios, and that's why she feels responsible for the upkeep. This could be a metaphor for a million different things, but we're not really concerned about that right now. The music, the back and forth, up and down, do, extremely effective at building anticipation. This is signaled to the viewer that this is a climax scene. A wide shot establishing the roses. We cross over the roses to view Anthe bordering on the precipice. You will remember one of the most impactful and poignant scenes of the series, Anthe's attempted suicide by jumping off a high building. She's literally on the edge. She's literally about to do it. She's done. The long, lingering shots suggest this. And the only reason she doesn't is because Utena arrives right before. Remember the last time we saw Utena was looking out that window, meaning that she was curious enough about Anthe. She cared enough to even approach her out of anger and resentment for what she showed with Toga earlier. Utena steps into the light right as this swell hits in the music. And these establishing shots of the rose garden show the distance between the characters that it is at the start of this scene. But in the next instant, Anthe's back in front of the garden, very close to the entrance, watering the roses, with her airs back on. She's put her proper face and her guise back on. She hid away those true suicidal thoughts. And she's once again the person that society expects her to be. And that right there, that is what Utena attacks immediately. She is upset that Anthe would choose to be that person that would flirt with Toga and would engage sexually with people just for the heck of it. But Anthe, very much aware that Utena is here out of her own selfish desires instead of any type of compassion or wanting to understand and save Anthe from what Anthe is dealing with, presses then exactly on what she knows that Utena is struggling with. It's very obvious after that scene in the pool. It's very obvious after she tucked the portrait away in her closet and was shocked that Anthe would pry into it and see it. Utena lashes out in violence and in rage, and Rachel Lillis kills it again.
What do you know? It was you, wasn't it? Toga started to act strange because of you. It was you, wasn't it?
And this back and forth is so relevant as an example and a metaphor for how we fail to understand what each other are going through, and then we lash out and hurt other people simply by not wanting or caring or trying to understand them and their problems and their situations because we're so stuck on our own. And this is their lowest point. But then Utena, in her rage, opens up and expresses some vulnerability and shows Anthe her pain. That is her issue. That's why she's here in Otri Academy. That's why she can't move on. Even though she's doing it in rage, she's still sharing her innermost conflict with Anthe. And as she does that, the video, it cuts to the warm, yellowish orange light that we've already associated with being together and understanding and compassion, and it focuses on that. And as we pull back to them, it paints Anthe again in the sexual light, in her role as submissive. And we could possibly insinuate here that it's something like a rape of Anthe. But Utena does not behave sexually. Instead, she starts crying. Crying because she realizes that Toga is dead. That the ideas of what the prince is supposed to be do not align with the boy and the purity that she saw in him. That the concept and the person of the prince that she was chasing after was all a deception. Her own deception. And she doesn't reconcile it until the scene later when she's talking with Toga. But she not only shows the strength of will to realize that her own goals don't align with the world's goals. Shiori has no crisis like this. But she also shares it with Anthe. Something that nobody else does in the series. Something that Juri and Mickey were given the opportunity in the previous scene to do, but they don't. Something that Anthe was just given the opportunity to do as Utena walked in the rose garden. But she fell back on what's expected of her, of what society should think of her role. This scene is poignant because Utena finally says what everybody else is thinking, what everybody else can't be honest enough with themselves to say, what everyone else is too cowed into not being able to share. This is Utena's only superpower, the only reason she's able to leave the academy, because she truly and honestly bears her heart in one emotional outburst, because she admits her weakness to another person. There is no prince. It doesn't add up. It can't. How powerful, how scandalous, how important a thing to say, and how simple and obvious, and how taboo. And that is what Anthe is thinking as she pets her hair. The first honest thing she's heard in God knows how long. The first time anyone's let their mask down around her. That is what Anthe is mulling over in her head. The fact that Utena, didn't come to see how Anthe was doing and can only think about her own pain first. But how close that is to Anthe's pain. And how that actually does reflect upon her as well. How Anthe was not strong enough to share with Utena her true self like Utena just did to Anthe. This very much is reflected in the painting scene, but we'll get there when we get to it. Look at how sad Anthe is here. Watch the colors shift here as the soft orange light goes away as Anthe leaves Utena. Then watch the sublime pacing and shot composition on the subtle reveal of the axe, not giving enough time to realize it's an axe. The shot of her raising it above her head, the double take of her raising it above her head and back down to Utena, and implications that she's going to destroy Utena. She's literally going to kill Utena. Metaphorically, she could take Utena's vulnerability that she's exposed to Anthe and used it to manipulate her and control her like Shiori did to Juri, or otherwise completely ruin Utena's life. That's why the others don't share that thing that they're dealing with that's holding them back, their idea of the prince that they can't get over, because it can be used like it is with Juri. And that's the decision Anthe makes right here. That's the decision she's thinking about. And that's the why when she swings the axe down, and it's not to destroy Utena with that information, but it's instead to honor Utena's wish and help her and embrace her and be that person to care about her and reach out that hand and say, "Here, I will help you get through this." That is why Anthe is the hero. That is why she makes this decision. That is why there's hope and a message of positivity in the genre of magical girls. That is why Ikehara can have his quote about wanting people to imagine a better future. That is why he can continue to make shows about the oppression of society and people that are able to subvert it and avoid it and rise above it together through each other, and with the power of faith, hope, love, understanding. Everything about life and how you view it is in that one axe swing. Everything from Sailor Moon to Penguin Drum to Madoka Magica to Evangelion to religion. This is everything and the only thing that matters. It is love. And that's why Anthe smiles a true smile. She's sacrificed for somebody else. And these shots pull the pair together in a series of reverse close-ups, getting progressively tighter and tighter. Without moving, without walking, no one walks anywhere in this scene. They've still, at the same time, become so much closer. And then the metaphor is complete. Utena said she was promised the stars, and Toga couldn't give that to her. But Anthe made an attempt to do just that. And the red roses of the prince, the ones that imprisoned Anthe at the very start of this film, are washed away, literally washed away. And we see the true forms, the real faces of both of the heroines. They find themselves amidst the roses, just as they found themselves amidst the roses. And they come together, and their togetherness pushes the red roses out, makes them fall. This journey that started all the way at the bottom with the grave of the red roses now is pushing the red roses out of the way at the top. It's so impossibly beautiful in both themes and on screen. They need not be beholden to the roses because they have each other. They have somebody that they can trust. Don't forget, always somewhere, someone is fighting for you. As long as you remember her, you are not alone. And the simple grace of having those people there with you, trusting in them and loving them and understanding them, even attempting to, even taking that first step, creates a whole new reality, a whole new world where you can be somebody completely different and empowered and free of your burdens. The framing of this scene is so perfect, it shows how it turns the entire world upside down. How it shifts everything on its head once you understand that and once you figure that out. But they haven't escaped yet with that. There's still work to be done. There's still stuff that needs to happen. This is not the resolution of the film. It is, however, the climax. And a single red rose shatters the illusion and shows that that was all upside down thinking. Or maybe it was us who were upside down the entire time. And that way of thinking was right side up. Either way, the starry sky is still bounded by that castle. Well, that's it. That's my favorite scene in all of anime and why I love it. It's the best scene I've ever seen in my life in any type of visual medium. And it's the climax of the first act of the Adolescence of Utena. There's so much more to talk about in this movie, especially now that Utena and Anthe have made the breakthrough on trusting each other. There's a lot more work to be done, though, in resolving their issues and also figuring out why Anthe is the way she is and why she decided to trust Utena in this scene. But we'll get to that in our next video.